All right, so what we're going to be looking at in today's lesson is we're going to be looking at the concept of political and economic change. And looking at this political and economic change, this terminology that we're going to see is going to really allow us to understand a lot of the things that are going on in the countries that we're going to be studying throughout the semester. So the first type of change that we're going to look at here is reform. This type of change does not advocate for the overthrow of basic institutions, but strives to change some of the methods that political and economic leaders use to reach their goals. So when we look at reform, it's a really gradual kind of concept, and it's like it says, it's using the institutions that are already in place within the country to be able to try and create that change. So you're going to see that through policy measures, legislation. You're going to see that through committee actions. You're going to see that through the people that we decide to vote in and out of office. All of these things are going to be these reform-type movements that are going to be put in place. So it's not a radical concept. It's a really gradual thing that kind of happens over time. Then we have revolution. This type of change implies change at a more basic level and involves either a major revision or an overthrow of existing institutions. So if you look at history, there are revolutions that take place, like the American Revolution or the French Revolution, that are bloody, in which people fight. You have opposite sides. You've got all the stuff going on. But revolution can also be peaceful, in which you see this with the British Empire a lot, especially towards the end, where you've got certain colonies that petition for independence because of one reason or another. That home country ends up granting them that independence. So you've got a non-violent revolution that takes place. And then you've got coups d'etats, and coups d'etats are generally led by the military. And a coup d'etat takes place when you have the leader of generally the military who is in charge, and they get military support, and they kill the current president or dictator or whoever's in charge, and then they themselves are instituted as the leader of that country. And these generally occur in weak states. Very rarely do you see any sort of coup d'etat in any sort of really established country. It's generally going to happen in a weak state because that infrastructure and popular support and things like that just don't exist. Some more attitudes towards change. Alright, so once again, the terms that we're going to look at here are going to be very different than how we see these terms when we talk about American politics. So keep that in mind, that as we use terms like liberal and conservative, that it doesn't fit into that framework that we see within American politics. The first one that we have here is radicalism. This is a belief that rapid, dramatic changes need to be made in the existing society, often including the political system. So if we go back and we look at that, revolution and coup d'etat are definitely going to fit into that radicalist concept because a lot of times they're rapid. You fight a lot. You're upheaving the entire institution as it currently exists. When we look at liberalism, this is a belief that reform should take place with gradual change. All right, so this goes back to what we were talking about when we talk about reform. So if reform is our gradual, you're not overthrowing the basic institutions, you're striving for change, all of these things, that's definitely going to fit into that liberalist concept because you're doing so on a very gradual basis. All right. Conservatives, they see change as disruptive, and they emphasize the fact that it sometimes brings unforeseen outcomes. So conservatives are going to be very cautious when it comes to change within the society, and they're going to be very resistant to that concept because they feel if things are going well within the country, then there's really no need to change because you might bring all sorts of bad things to the nation because of that change. So we also have reactionary beliefs. Reactionaries oppose revolution and reform and wish for their system to go back to a time that they feel was a golden age. So we're going to see this kind of concept a little bit when we talk about England, and we'll talk about that when we get to that. But reactionaries don't believe in change really in any sort of way, and if they do believe in change, they believe in going back to how something was before. Then we've got democratization. Democratization is the concept that non-democratic nations are becoming democratic. This means that competitive elections are regular, free, and fair. All right, so we're going to look at a couple of countries that have gone from more of that dictator style or communist style, and that they are moving into democratic concepts. Russia is going to be one of those that we're going to look at, and there's a little bit, while they have gone through a democratic process, there are definitely some questions about the regularity or the freeness of their elections, and especially the fairness of those elections. So we'll kind of talk about how democratization takes place and some of the barriers to that, and some of the not so great success stories. All right. Countries that have the following characteristics are considered to be liberal democracies. All right, so free and fair elections. All right, so you show up, you can vote. There's no ballot box stuffing. There's nobody voting multiple times. Everybody can show up and vote. So that would definitely, all of those things would fall under that category of being free and fair elections. People within the nation are guaranteed civil liberties. So like we've talked about before, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, to be able to voice those opinions. So we're going to look at some countries that are kind of on that democratic side that either A, guarantee these things, or there are some limits to those, and we can look at how sometimes the democratization process doesn't completely take hold. The rule of law, like we talked about before, that everybody has to follow the law, regardless of whether or not you're the leader or a follower. The neutrality of the judiciary, so that you walk into a court being innocent until proven guilty, rather than having to prove your innocence, and that everybody's going to be treated equal before that court. That there's an open civil society, and when we look at that, we mean that citizens have private lives, and the media operates independently of the government. So when I go home, I get to make the decisions that I want to make, and when you go home, you get to make the decisions as a family that you want to make. And that the government's not intrusive on that as far as forcing you to do things. And the media operates independently. So when we look at our media, you don't have the government, who's an owner of those media outlets, telling them what to say and controlling the message that gets out to the people. And then you get civilian control of the military. We have civilians in the military. You're not forced into the military. And while the government plays a role in deploying and instituting those things, it's civilians that are part of that, and we don't have people that are forced into that service. And substantive democracies have access to multiple sources of information to make decisions. So when you look at it, we've got the internet, we've got all sorts of different websites that are controlled by different people for that. We have multiple different television stations, we've got lots of newspapers. Even though there's definitely been a contraction as far as the concept of free media within the country, there's still the ability to find information from multiple different places so that you can make an educated decision as to what's going on within the society. All right, so why democratization? Why do countries move from communist countries into this concept? Why do they move from dictators into democratic concepts? One of the reasons is the loss of legitimacy. And we talked about the three different types of legitimacy in a previous presentation. But when you lose that legitimacy, whether it be charismatic, whether it be legal, whether it be any of those different kinds of concepts, you're going to lose that ability to lead the people. You're going to lose that concept of power. People are no longer going to want to listen to the things that you say. So both right and left-wing authoritarian regimes, when they lose that, it generally ends in revolution or some sort of coup or something like that. Okay? An expansion of the urban middle class. As the middle class gets bigger, they're going to demand more things. And as they demand more things and more rights, the government is either A, going to react to that by trying to put those things down. But if that middle class continues to get bigger, they're going to have a greater sway on what happens within the government, even if it is a dictatorship, and that may throw it into revolution. It may throw it into those different types of things. So as the middle class gets bigger, you're going to move more towards democratic ideals. A new emphasis on human rights by the U.S. and the EU. So as the United States and the European Union start to push a lot of other countries to allow for civil rights, allow for more human rights, more equality concepts and things like that, then that definitely pushes more to democratization. And the snowball effect. One country gains democratic ideals and they start to flourish and things like that, and then they put more pressure on others, and then those countries start to see that and they start to flourish a little bit more. And that's just like when you take a little snowball and roll it down a mountain, it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's the idea behind the snowball effect. All right. We also have the idea of consolidation. When a political system moves from a procedural democracy to a substantive democracy, it is said to have experienced political liberalization. So remember that procedural democracy, which is also known as an illiberal democracy, that those concepts, that you've got some democratic concepts in place, but you don't necessarily have the civil society built up, you don't necessarily have the free and fair elections built up the way that you would want to. As you move from that into being more of a democracy like the UK or like the United States, it's called political liberalization. And this generally happens because of the following concepts. One is you've got a revolution of rising expectations. So that goes back to what we talked about, the expansion of the middle class. That as people start to get more, they start to like it. And then they want more, and then they want more, and then they want more. And they want a better standard of living through health care, through income equality, through lots of different things like that, that as that rising expectations comes along, it starts to push the government more into a liberalized idea. And then you've got democratic consolidation. And this is when a stable political system is supported by all parts of the society. So that's going to be business, that's going to be people, that's going to be all sorts of different places that are going to be part of that concept. All right, so let's look at a couple of different types of economies that we're going to see throughout the semester. One is, in order to achieve the equality sought by Karl Marx, communist countries relied on a command economy. So when we look at that theoretical concept of what communism is, which is never really put in place throughout the world, is that you have equality of outcome, not necessarily equality of opportunity. In order to try and push that idea, the idea of the command economy is that you have a central party that dominates everything. They plan everything. There is no free market concept. There is no competition. The government says this is what you're going to build, and then you're going to build it, which has a lot of inherent issues, because if you lose that ability and desire to compete, then it's going to not spur on opportunity. It's not going to spur on development and things like that. So there are a lot of issues with that concept of the command economy. All right. The economic system has largely failed, and these nations have experienced shift towards market economies. So most command economies, even if we're looking at communist countries, most of those communist nations that still exist have largely pushed to a market-based economy or some sort of mixed market concept. And that's why you see throughout history why the vast majority of command economies or communist nations have failed. By going through this process, countries are experiencing economic liberalization. So they're providing more freedoms to their people through economic concepts. All right, so when we look at mixed economies or free economies, which is going to be really pretty much on the opposite side of that command economy concept, is one debate exists is, do you use a mixed economy or do you use a market economy? So a mixed economy allows for some government control, and a free market economy is purely based upon market changes. All right, so quantity supplied versus quantity demanded, that's all going to be that as far as the free market concept. In the mixed concept, you have the government has the ability to impose certain restrictions and things like that on the, the idea that there is no monopolies, the ideas that you can't use lead paint and toys. Those would all be things that arise from a mixed economy, and there's a large debate as to which is the right way to go. All right, nations that are shifting towards market economies are experiencing marketization and privatization. Marketization describes the state's recreation of a market in which property, labor, goods, and services can all function in a competitive form. All right, so that you've got multiple types of one business, multiple types of another, and they have the ability to compete and try and make the best product. And then we have privatization. This is the transfer of state-owned property to private ownership. So when you see communist nations move to democratic concepts, when you see them move from those command economies to more market economies, you're going to see that the amount of state-owned property is going to be reduced and the amount of privately owned property is going to increase. And we've got social movements and civil society. A social movement refers to organized collective activities that aim to bring about or resist fundamental change in an existing group or society. All right, so these social movements, we're going to see lots of different types of social movements as we go throughout the semester. Some that are going to be pro-state, some that are going to be anti-state. All right. So, when we look at these things, because they are supposed to be able to create a change within the society, and they are supposed to create a change within the government and things like that. So when we look at different types of social movements, you can look at interest groups, and interest groups are going to play a part in looking at very specific kinds of concepts. It can be through voting practices, it can be through constitutional amendments, it can be through all sorts of things when we look at that idea of social movement. And we also have to look at the idea of civil society. Civil society refers to voluntary organizations outside of the state that help people define and advance their own interests. So these organizations may represent class, religious, or ethnic interests, or they may cut across them. So when we look at this, you could have a Catholic, or you look at FCA, Florida, or Fellowship of Christian Athletes. You look at those different things. You look at class-based concepts, different organizations that you can be part of. All of these things are going to play a part in developing the civil society of a nation. And whether or not those things actually exist, because when we look at China later on, there's very little development of the civil society in that country, because a lot of the organizations and things like that we would join, Key Club or schools or religious groups and things like that, a lot of those things just don't exist in China. So we're going to see a varying degree of development of these ideas in various different countries.